Introduce our keynote speaker today. I'm very pleased to welcome back to Secretariat Seminary and School of Theology, the Most Reverend Joseph Nathaniel Perry, Auxiliary Bishop of the Archdiocese of Chicago. Bishop Perry was an adjunct faculty member here for many years before being ordained a bishop in 1998. In addition to undergraduate degrees in philosophy and theology, he earned an MDiv at St. Francis de Sales Seminary, and then a licentiate in Canon Law from the Catholic University of America. A native of Chicago, he was ordained a priest for the Archdiocese of Milwaukee in 1975. As a member of the USCCB, Bishop Perry serves as chairman of the Committee on African American Catholics. He also serves on several other USCCB committees, including the Committee for Education, the Ad Hoc Committee on Catholics' Use of Holy Scripture, the Secretariat for Family, Laity, Women, and Youth, and the Ad Hoc Committee for a Plenary Council. In addition, Bishop Perry has served the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, the Subcommittee for the Defense of Marriage, and the Subcommittee for Migrants, Refugees, and Travelers. He is also the National Chaplain for the Knights of St. Peter Claver and the Ladies Auxiliary, as well as the Vice President of the Board of the Black Catholic Congress. As Auxiliary Bishop of Chicago, Bishop Perry serves as the Episcopal Vicar for Vicariate 6. In 2010, he was named by then Cardinal Francis George to be the diocesan postulator for the sainthood cause of Father Augustus Tolton, the subject of his talk today for the Spring 2021 Dehon Lecture. Please join me in welcoming Bishop Perry. Welcome home, Bishop Perry.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Father Raul, Dr. Shippey, Chris McAtee. Special tribute to our Milwaukee seminarians, my home. Happy St. Patty's Day. St. Patrick is my confirmation sponsor. My father insisted that I take his name as my patron saint because it was his. Fathers know best. Thank you for honoring Father Augustus Tolton here at the Dehon House. A very touching story that I would like to elucidate for you. Rome has been very interested in his dossier, and we hope and pray that things will route themselves to proper conclusion with his declaration as being beatified and eventually a saint. The possibility of sainthood for Venerable Augustus Tolton embodies extraordinarily significant and unprecedented stature at all levels of the Church. He is, as you may know, the first identified priest of African descent to work anywhere in the United States. His ordination to the priesthood was taken simultaneously as an anomaly in the predominant community and a news sensation in the Black community. His cause in Rome necessarily asks for broad participation and collaboration, particularly the African American Catholic community and the wider Catholic community here in the United States, for purposes of a successful outcome of the examination, the scrutiny, and the approval, and hopefully the declarations of sainthood. Tolton's light shines through the social deficits of an earlier time in this country as a singular, lonesome Christian witness to countless others squelched by the barriers of race discrimination and segregation. He is a shining light of Christian stamina, of innocence and virtue, not without, of course, the cross of emotional upset and doubt. self-doubt. And by means of Father Tolton's trials, he has paved the way for the graces of the gospel to bless the African American community. And by his life, Black Catholics see a copy of the Christ, and his church, which is ever in need of conversion to Christ. I've come to know Augustus Tolton as a prayerful man whose life gives many indications of his association with Jesus Christ in his suffering and humble nature. In this, he showed himself a Christ figure for the 19th century, but not only for that century, but our own times that continue to need human examples of the Jesus who moves among us. I would like to do three things in the time allotted in this first session, and that is to review with you certain salient facts of his life, describe the aspects of his spirituality found in his person, whose virtues are being offered by the church for emulation, and then to highlight the message that Tolton seems to leave us for these times. We placed at your seats a little brief trifold simple biography of Tolton. You could take it with you. And also there's one of the 5 photos that are extant of him. You have a copy of that with the prayer for his canonization on the reverse side. When it comes to the church's highest authority, raising up individual Catholics or a group of Catholics worthy of our notice and imitation, the church is not interested in famous people, celebrities, or historical figures of note. Declaring someone or someone's a saint or saints is, of course, the highest citation the church can bestow upon anyone. And in so doing, the church is saying that the person or persons lived the gospel of Jesus Christ with heroic seriousness, in instances at the cost of their lives. Most saints, of course, died unremarkable deaths with their transition. Others had their bodies savagely ripped apart by those who hate the church or the Christ, people whom we dub as martyrs. Many of them suffered with the stamp of the cross pressed to their persons in a variety of manifestations. The message of Jesus Christ, in other words, shines through their life's pattern, and therefore can be taken as a model by those who wish, like them, to get close to the person of the Lord. I think of Father Augustus Tolton as a patron saint of inclusion. In this, he was ahead of his time. The 19th century revealed a society and a Christian church in this country unready for instances of racial integration and inclusion, whether they happen spontaneously or by leadership of certain charismatic or religious leaders. It was for these reasons that Father Tolton was persecuted by fellow priests and ministers, and eventually was treated with indifference by his own bishop and told to get out of town because the situation of whites and blacks coming together under the same roof, albeit a church roof, provoked visual and emotional dissonance in some folks. Segregation of the races was the rule of law and lawless custom in the United States. And for this reason, Franciscan friars, the Sacred Heart province here in the Midwest, maneuvered to get Tolton to a seminary in Rome, because seminaries in the United States in those days did not accept people of my complexion. And the church was unable or was timid to puncture through the racial boundaries of that day and thereby risk losing patronage and benefaction and reputation in a largely Protestant milieu. The Urbanum Seminary, or the Urban Seminary, under the auspices of the Propaganda Fide in Rome, where was found students of Asian, African, Hispanic, South Pacific, and Byzantine heritage, prepared seminarians to be missionary priests in far-off lands. So it was thought that once ordained, Tolton should be assigned someplace in Africa. It was thought that the social climate in the United States would obstruct Tolton's work as a priest. 6 years of study later, 1880 to 1886, the cardinal prefect of the propaganda, Cardinal Giovanni Simeoni, told Tolton the night before his ordination that he overturned the vote of the seminary officials and instead would be sending Tolton back to the United States to his home diocese of Alton in Illinois. Today it's Springfield. The cardinal remarked in his biography that the US Church owed it to itself to have a priest of African descent. The cardinal emphasized that if the United States was as enlightened as it claimed to be, Augustus would be accepted. The Vatican had faith that grace would win out in the United States. Although quite surprised at the late news of the change of orders, Augustus followed the cardinal's advice, inspired by his propaganda oath, and returned to his bishop at Quincy, Illinois in July of 1886. Well, the United States, as Rome would come to learn, was not quite that enlightened. The United States suffered a gaping wound, as you know, lingering from its own civil war. Unbeknownst to Cardinal Simeoni, he was sending Tolton back to be nailed to a cross. Tolton was essentially launched as a missionary to inaugurate the church's work among a neglected race, but not without walking through a gauntlet of racial hostility still simmering after the war between the states, where Americans slaughtered one another over the question whether slaves and their descendants could be considered equals to white citizenry. Augustus Tolton, a former slave himself, received partial acceptance in his hometown of Quincy, but turmoil all too soon surrounded him. Prejudiced opposition mounted against him from both Protestant and Catholic clergy, and one German priest in particular, Father Michael Weiss. They thought Tolton should restrict himself to ministering to Blacks. As it was, white Catholics were sneaking into Tolton's church, inspired by his gentle manner. They came voluntarily to his masses and other ministrations and contributed financially to his poor parish. But Father Weiss told his parishioners to stay away from that nigger church and that nigger priest, and took his objections to the bishop any number of times. Tolton was called in and reprimanded. He was accused of disturbing the Protestants who looked askance at him for spreading Romanism in the area. And he was accused by Catholic clergymen of creating an unacceptable situation of a mingling of the races. Being Black and Catholic, Tolton lost on both counts. Folks could not put the two together. There were no protocols for being a Black priest, called in principle to serve everyone, but pushed back every time. With every step Tolton took, he was violating some written or unwritten rule. In due time, in midst of the storm, sympathetic white people stopped coming to his church. As a whispering campaign mounted about Tolton, it became apparent that he would be asked to leave Quincy, where he had begun a credible ministry to the Negro community and where Black Catholics were already accustomed to the gift of a priest who looked like them. In midst of the furor, the Irish Archbishop of Chicago, Patrick Fian, issued an invitation to Father Tolton to come work among African Americans there. Tolton hesitated giving an answer to the Archbishop until the situation in Quincy became personally intolerable. And with permission of his superiors in Rome, he finally accepted Fian's invitation, packed his things, said bye to his mother and sister, promising to send for them later, and took a train to Chicago the week before Christmas of 1889. Keep in mind, Tolton grew up in a climate where it was forbidden for a Black man to look a white man in the eye when spoken to, or while addressing a white man. A time in which it was inconceivable for Blacks to mingle in the same space as whites. Growing up, I remember distinctly my parents telling me that when a white person speaks to me, I should look them straight in the eye and not have my eyes cast to the ground. It was a time where a train ride meant there was only one railroad car set aside for Blacks, and if there weren't enough seats, you had to stand until a seat was freed up. And where public restrooms and eating establishments, rooming houses were off limits to Blacks, laws written and unwritten, humiliations of one sort or another cemented the inferior status of Black people who were without the right of recourse or appeal. In the midst of all this, Father Tolton proved a wise and effective priest, but his priesthood was hampered by isolation, the extreme poverty of his congregants, his own self-doubt, and economic hardship. Amongst his written letters which have survived, some of them to Mother Catherine Drexel and Josephite Father James Slattery, portray much of his anguish in that socially intolerant era. Tolton was dedicated to the people and faithfully visited the sick and came to the rescue of the desperate poor on Chicago's South Side, tenement and dilapidated neighborhoods. Even Protestants sent for him on their deathbeds. The period of Reconstruction, some say, was worse than the Civil War. Efforts to secure constitutional rights of the newly emancipated met with concerted and often violent pushback, especially in the South. Random killings here and there and bitterly contested battles in Washington over the issue. The drumbeat of inequality was reinforced in 1896, the year before Tolton died, with the Supreme Court's decision Plessy versus Ferguson and a vote of 7-1, which endorsed as lawful the various state laws ordering racial separation under the social doctrine of separate but equal. This decision gave constitutional legitimacy to the many practices our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents grew up with. Separate washrooms, separate entrances into buildings, separate drinking fountains, restaurant and public transportation facilities, separate schools, all that aided and abetted a culture of discrimination and unfair treatment. Much of this spilled over into the churches. This was the world that Father Tolton knew and within which he died suddenly at the age of 43, his experiences having taken a toll on his emotional and physical health. Augustus carried a heavy cross through most of his life. He was a man beset on all sides by racism and its tragic consequences. No one had ever seen a Roman collar around the neck of a Black man before in this country. It was considered an anomaly in the white community, but a new sensation in the Black community. Some questioned whether he was really a priest. Some accused the Roman Catholic Church of defying the laws of the land by propping up a Black man as a priest. Yet Tolton dared to believe that no door could be closed against the movement of the Lord and the power of the Spirit. Through it all, Tolton remained a faithful priest, a welcome minister of souls, regardless who they were, Black or white. He consistently showed himself an open and optimistic spirit. He carried a pastor's heart, and his loyalty to the church was without guile. His holiness arises from his perseverance, his patient suffering in face of repeated disappointment, his dutifulness in the face of some large odds, his cheerfulness, his pastoral zeal, his abiding love for the church, and an unfailing sense of obedience. He carried the cross of being the first priest of his time. And in all this, he remains to this day an uplifting sign of hope and promise. The United States, as you know, is a country that immigrants consider a land of opportunity and freedom. Now, this opportunity and freedom has come in part by the shedding of blood and a great loss of life and much grief. A story still narrated in the oral sayings running through peoples of various ethnicities. Ours is a land still where isolated incidents of racial violence, hate crimes, and overt and covert practices of inequality take place. All is not perfect here. And sometimes the gospel message of human dignity has not been proclaimed clearly enough by word and example in our churches and institutions. At best, this American thing remains a work in progress. As an American born, Tolton, of course, is of our culture. He battled to make the culture better and more Christ-like. Every one of us can, and many have, participated in this battle with him. White people participated in the Underground Railroad's rescue of runaway slaves. The Underground Railroad authenticated the basic humanity of Blacks and those participating in that rescue of Blacks seeking freedom. Back in Quincy, several visionary priests and men and women religious had taken the young Tolton by the hand and walked with him through the dark forest of racial bigotry and worked a victory in doing so. His cause for declared sainthood reveals a touching story of perseverance and goodwill. Tolton is an inspirational model of how we Christians can handle persecution and hardship along life's path, navigating the disappointments that life throws at us. For a devout young man who struggled so much for acceptance, a former slave and faithful priest who was delivered the word no more often than not, we hope the church can say yes to raising him to the honors of the altar as a saint. All of us have been nudged to pause and reflect on what has been happening to our nation that can't seem to rise above its problem, affirming racial equality on all fronts. Anti-Black racism in particular has exposed subliminal thoughts and fears people thought were buried or solved post-civil rights legislation of the 1960s, yet ever so often resurface. I ask the question, what can a repentant church like ours do to break through history's intransigence? How can we form the people who sit in our pews out of the best of our social justice tradition and social teaching tradition? Indeed, even devout and pious parishioners shock us sometimes with manifestations of their thoughts and behaviors about people of color. Father Tolton discovered a church and society unready for the type of ministry he was devoted to. Inspired by some of the best examples of Catholic life and praxis, and people like Notre Dame Sister Herlinda Sick from Milwaukee, Father Peter McGeer and Father Michael Rickard, Tolton was made to believe in his impressionable years growing up that all Christians were like these visionary individuals. But then that was one side of the church, and the side of the church that rescued him in his youth, embraced him, accepted him for the content of his character. But there was too that other side of the church that was complicit in the general mood of society that demeaned him and his race, seeing Blacks as intruders upon the well-being and comfort level of the white community. The society within which you and I move rests comfortably with the idea that there are and always will be marginalized communities, most of them people of color. In the spirit of Pope Francis, Catholics have a duty to work the marginalized into mainstream society, or put in other words, to as far as possible, deconstruct much of the disparities between mainstream communities and marginalized communities, differentiations that show up routinely as racial and economic disparities in things like fair housing practices, job availability and a living wage, access to health care, education, fair treatment by law enforcement, humane immigration policies, to name several. Here and there, we have to muster the courage to break through our hesitancy to reference these social and racial imbalances and manifestations of these in our church, and how Catholics in our pews, unbeknownst to themselves sometimes, are divided up by disparities across the board, from north to south, east to west, how dominant society looks upon a Black person and sees at best a walking symbol of their greatest fears, how assumptions about race circumscribe people's imaginations and their support of racial hierarchies. The effort here is not to chastise whiteness or to make people feel guilty. Maybe a little guilt is all right. We Catholics are used to guilt. The effort is, I think, to instill empathy in the lives of Christians, deeper understanding, and a genuine sense of community. In this, the church is seen as a credible voice in the community. And this is what Father Tolton was about. Certain attitudes and perceptions arising in public discourse and reported in the media reduce others to being modern-day lepers, those we avoid for fear of being caught up in their problems or crises, those who we don't allow into our space, those who don't fit our image of belonging. These modern lepers are found outside our city gates. They are dismissed with simplistic labels and unfair stereotypes, pushed aside from being part of our lives. But the Christ who heals lepers comes to heal us, as well as our debilitating sense of self that blinds us to the sacredness and the dignity of those whom we keep at arm's length. Christ comes to heal us of our own leprosy so that we are able to realize again that God extends his compassion and grace even to the likes of us. Before God, in the words of Pope Francis, no one is an outcast. No one is beyond the touch of God. All of us are sons and daughters of God. All of us are made in the image of the God of justice, peace, and reconciliation. These are the mantras that imbue our various ministries. I'm preaching to the choir here in respects, but even we often settle for that penchant of American society that prefers a white environment, for we deem it the most profitable, safe, and secure environment, supportive of our comfort zones. Many of the Christian faithful, even amidst their own discomfort with these topics, expect the gospel of neighborly regard to be preached by us. And I think there's a way to do this without assaulting people, but to resurrect in folks the noblest sentiments and understanding stemming from the inspiration of the gospel. And most importantly, our ministerial consciences prod us to do so. Given the emotion-charged nature of these topics, some people will get up and leave while you're speaking. It happened to one of our priests, the Feast of the Baptism of the Lord, back in January. He was referencing some of these items, and a group of his parishioners got up and walked out. It made the first page of the Chicago Tribune. And the priest himself spoke to me saying he received over 3,500 emails from people from around the world commenting on that news item and his homily that he spoke at all 5 masses that weekend, and people got up and walked out. He said most of those 3,500 were affirming and positive. There were some that were very negative and hostile as well, but most were affirmative. But then, you know, they did the same thing to Jesus Christ. People left, but they can think about it for a while, hopefully, and because they were cut to the heart with truth. And then some will return, maybe a few, because truth is always terribly attractive, and will bother you for a while. Time magazine recently reported that incidents of racial hatred and violent right-wing extremism are on the rise in our country. Why is that? Anti-Semitic attacks have increased, hitting an all-time high in 2019. Already, 2018, we witnessed the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in US history, the shooting at the Pittsburgh Tree of Life of synagogue. The Latino community was targeted, of course, in El Paso in 2019. Anti-Asian hate crimes shot up last year with almost 1,900 reported incidents around the country. African Americans reported a spike in bias crimes in wake of George Floyd's infamous knee pressed on the neck killing by a police officer. And topping all of these are various Unite the Right rallies starting in Charlottesville that ended in a deadly encounter in 2017. When our country was younger, immigrants tended to cluster in ghettos with others of their own nationality or background and religion. It was more comfortable and lessened the fears about the pressures of assimilation in a complex society. This kind of association featured Catholic life and practice. Eventually, predictably, subsequent generations blended themselves into the American melting pot, bringing with it a new set of social demands, living alongside, around the corner, down the street, from people of different ethnic and racial and religious backgrounds, eating different foods, and with differing views of life. I ask, can we morally be satisfied with our parishes as bastions of whiteness, especially if nothing is done to deconstruct that segregation with the beauty of color predicated in people, in ministries and worship? It seems to me that there is a disconnect between the glowing statements that we make in the songs we sing in church and the prayers we pray during Mass, saying that we are brothers and sisters in Christ. Maybe here, but not over here, and not there. We live separately from one another. We worship God separately on Sunday, one another. And uses these glowing words and songs to sound hollow about something that exists merely in theory, but it's not true in practice. Privacy, individualism, and economic well-being are all high-priced values in American society, we all know. The fundamental belief at the heart of racial resentment that you find in corners of our society is that people get what they deserve or what they earn or work for, based on merit. Consequently, there are those who have merit and those who don't have merit. And when people see that certain groups receive sidebar attention in the form of resources or certain advantages, they develop resentment towards that group or groups. An African-American political scientist, Dr. Darren Davis at Notre Dame University, says, when people perceive others benefiting unfairly, that's when social problems occur, and some people get violent. People in our pews are not necessarily motivated by feelings of hatred or superiority, but resentment of this kind has the same effect as if they were, in that they wind up supporting racist policies and ideologies before they notice what they're thinking or saying or doing. Dr. Davis says, we don't really have a solution to racial resentment. And he doesn't know how there is a solution. It's omnipresent in the human condition. We've seen this happening among other ethnic groups here and abroad. Life is extremely competitive, and life oftentimes shows off its shortages rather than its plenty. And in the face of the fears we have about the shortages of life, sometimes we can lose our sense of equilibrium. We, Christian leaders, can aid changing the culture of our communities to lead the way as only Christians can. It's the evangelical summons, I think, of the moment and has been for some time. Can we help create parish cultures where anyone who sees your Catholic parish campus or institution will rest assured that they will be welcomed visiting or even be welcome to join the parish and would not be treated as a stranger or someone who does not belong? People of my complexion and darker are plagued by this stop in your tracks question every time we approach a white environment. How will I be received? Will people stare at me or turn their backs to me or refuse to shake my hand at the sign of peace? Most of us are not going to be in positions where we can foist massive structural institutional change. Others seem to hold the cards in that regard. But we can influence the corners of society where we live and have influence. There are movements and forces seemingly beyond us. One example being white flight. As a church, we follow people where they move and hope we can change their attitude while they're packing their belongings. But often that's not the case. But we end up seeing to a church built where they move. The reasons for their moving and shifting are mixed. Many of the folks we live and worship with, share faith with, usually operate with some measure of diversity ordered by law or policy, scheduled in the workplace, the place of business, the school place, and so forth. But this is not the case at the end of the day with their domestic place or other places where they recreate, and certainly on Sunday where they worship. That's the scandal. We take for granted that this is the way things are, that we live and worship God separate from one another in solo racial enclaves. We have settled that this situation is normative, lending towards an observable enculturation of worship that has certain merits, certainly, by default. Yet as ministers of the church, ladies and gentlemen, we are too aware of the cultural divide that exists among whites and blacks and browns and Asians and others. And therefore, we have to strive to forge breakthroughs into spatial separation by way of connections among the faithful so that these solo racial enclaves, especially on Sunday, do not exacerbate fears and suspicions and unwarranted competition that would prevent us from seeing each other as one family, brothers and sisters in the Lord that we sing and pray about in the general intercessions at Mass on Sunday and feast days and days in between. This routine spatial segregation of our lives and its unfortunate consequences is odd this way. It was not how the church began, of course, as you know, at Pentecost, where people of different shaped noses and different colored eyes and different hues of skin, speaking different languages, were at Jerusalem surrounded by the Christ event on that day. And somewhere along the line in the path of history, we lost appreciation for that template. And separation became the rule of life and religion for us. Christians that we are, I think we're summoned to cultivate our spaces to be inclusive as far as this is possible. It proves a dogged effort on all counts. If you have nothing akin to it in your parishes where you work or minister or working in, I routinely welcome to others, whether your parishes are in a city, suburban, rural, regardless of racial or ethnic portrait, can benefit from a committed committee of the parish council, so to speak, devoted to efforts at racial equity and inclusion. monitoring the critical summons to social awareness and outreach, hospitality and ministries and activities of the parish, moving beyond these self-imposed boundaries. This, of course, is something deeper than just vestibule hospitality with ushers. In instances of predominantly Black parishes or predominantly white parishes or predominantly whatever parishes, we should always be aware by sensitive Christian conscience, and I learned this from Bishop Richard Scalba, that the spaces where we live, the spaces that we occupy, especially the Sunday assembly, we should feel that they are incomplete in terms of our Pentecost template, and then take strides for fuller representation of the kingdom our hope is geared towards. I will end with this quote from America Magazine's this recently January issue of 2021. Maybe some of you saw it. It was a column written by a white Catholic woman by the name of Shannon K. Evans. It was titled, "When White Catholics Suffer from Not Knowing the Marginalized." And she says this: "Most of us white Christians do not have encounters with people of color, for we have so arranged our lives, our schools, our churches, and our cities to avoid looking into their eyes. We cannot be changed by what we never encounter. Many Catholics, quote, serve the least of these, unquote, through fundraisers for women's care centers, donating diapers, or dropping off meals to homeless shelters, efforts that seek to change things for others without necessarily changing ourselves. The result can be a kind of Christian duty that is sincere, but not transformative. Often we have no proximity to the ones who have been broken by our political and economic systems. We're not hearing their stories, sitting in their living rooms or breaking bread together at the table of reciprocity," unquote. So, brothers and sisters, we keep chipping away at the problem as only Christians can, shaping our parish communities and our institutions into oases of race-neutral hospitality, all in hopes that our efforts become contagious, forming a genuine Christian culture, seen worth copying in other places. This was the theme of our first priest, Father Augustus Tolton. Thank you for listening.
We do have now about 10 minutes for discussion, question, answer. I'd like to perhaps start. Bishop, would you mind? Do you have a mic over there? Would you mind returning? Thank you. First, I should say thank you so much for your presentation. One of the things that very much struck me, Bishop, is you mentioned our need to speak out. You certainly mentioned the need for bravery. You mentioned beautiful image of our Pentecost template and the need to sort of, actually forge breakthroughs in the kind of white bastion that our churches often are. So I'm thinking, so we continuously, we sort of need this courage, this bravery, this speaking out, there's something very forward and pressing about it. And what strikes me is the sort of contrast with so many other voices in our culture. So there are a lot of protests. There's a great deal of anger, of outrage. And I'm just sort of wondering how we can do what you would suggest or urge us to reflect on as we try to be brave and speak, but without becoming as shrill as the more sort of ideological voices of our culture, where everybody's just guilty of profound everything, and there's no way to move forward. So could you speak about that at all?
Sure.
Thank you.
Speaking out is done most often, I think, eloquently with gestures before words. You know, St. Francis used to say, preach the gospel, and if necessary, you have to use words. Or it's the same with social justice in the church. Most people are touched and impressed by gestures. I was speaking to a group of seminarians at Mundelein yesterday, and they asked a similar question. I was telling them, you know, we haven't had many priests of our racial definition because seminaries wouldn't accept us. There's only a few Black priests in the United States. So most of our communities have been ministered by priests of Caucasian descent. And I told them and I warned them, you don't have to do much to make an inroads into a Black Catholic church. People are open, they will love you dearly, they will worship you. All you have to do is love them back. African American communities are not caught up in these ecclesiological questions and culture wars and stuff. We're busy about surviving day after day and trying to find our freedom in God. You see, the rest of the stuff is, you know, so you don't have to do much. It's your gestures, it's your kindliness, it's what he did, modeling to white and Black alike, that God loves them and God was with them despite all the other stuff that was going on in the society of his time. Every social movement, of course, has its extremes, here and abroad. I don't focus on the extremes myself. I think there's a great deal that we can accomplish coming into the side doors and maybe even the back door, but not storming necessarily the Capitol with billy clubs and epithets and all that kind of stuff. That's not where Christianity is. It's not where the Lord Christ was. It's certainly not where he was. That's why he's remembered. The others, maybe they will be remembered, but not in the way, an appreciative way in which he was. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Bishop, for sharing your insight. We just got a question coming in. Was your formation at the time as a priest also was fraught with racial tensions?
I was born and raised in Chicago until I left for seminary to pursue my fortune. In the late 50s, early 60s, it was not easy getting into seminaries in this country still. But I was recruited by the Capuchin Fathers to study high school seminary up at St. Lawrence, Mount Calvary, Wisconsin, north of Milwaukee. Our class entered there in 1962. The Capuchin Fathers are noted, almost similar to the Sacred Heart Fathers, as having mission ministries in other parts of the world. And this particular province of Capuchins, based in Detroit, was working in El Salvador and Nicaragua. So they were on the forefront of all of that strife and civil unrest and martyrdom that was going on in Central America. They were working in Black parishes and in Native American mission sites in Montana, in North and South Dakota. So the Capuchins have always been social justice minded. And so that was the climate in which I was raised as a seminarian and educated with them. They're part of certainly my high school and college and first couple of years of theology. And then I went into the frying pan by joining the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. The urban desert, so to speak, where all things happen. All things are possible. So no, I was quote unquote privileged that way, of having a nurturing community in that regard.
Good morning, Bishop, and thank you so much for your insight. The question is, thinking about the impact of your call to break down Sunday racial enclaves on seminary formation, how should race and economic background impact the teaching parish placement of seminarians? Should seminarians be permitted to serve at teaching parishes full of people just like them?
Sure. I have no problem with that. I think a seminarian properly formed and attuned to the issues of the day can bring an inspiration and a modeling in his own work and with people of a solo racial community. He can bring an articulation and those necessary gestures that will indicate that. I believe that. It will not necessarily be in his purview to overturn life for that particular parish because he's still someone in training, someone in learning. But I think there is a witness that he can convey, whatever parish that is, whether it's a Mexican parish, a Black parish, or white parish, or whatever parish. No. Take every opportunity to be the Christ to others.
We have one more question. What can we do as future priests and religious to implement interculturality in the parishes, seminaries, and our houses?
I think you have to do, I think it helps to structure diversity in everything we do. And that's more than just having a reading in Spanish as the first reading, or singing a Polish hymn at the offertory. We have to somehow break through the walls, the boundaries, cross the railroad tracks and so forth. And actually, as this woman I quoted from America Magazine, when it comes to clasping hands and arms and listening to people's stories and inviting people to be a part of the broader Christian witness. I think that is very powerful, and it can begin to help create a new consciousness and change the culture for us. It will not necessarily mean that Michael Jordan and his cousins and aunts and uncles are going to move into your community and live next door to you, because that probably is not acceptable. But what you do locally in your own locus, in your own household, makes a difference. I think we have to begin looking at our own formation, the way we were raised. What messages did we hear in the kitchen of our relatives who talked about those people? And how that has shaped our own biases and prejudices, unwittingly so, about other people. Those who are married, who do your kids hang around with? Are they all white? Are all your friends and acquaintances as adults, are they all white? Are they all Black? Are they all Hispanic? I think we are beyond that at this point in history in 2021, I would like to think. He started it and got in trouble for it. But we have to be aware of what our formation has been. And hopefully, if we are aware and reflect upon that, we will be so inspired to move out of our conclaves of exclusiveness and fear of other people. Does that make sense? It's very subtle work, but it's dogged work. And it needs an articulation and a leadership on the part of priests and ministers, catechists, so forth, youth ministers, to think and behave differently.
Thank you, Bishop. Forgive me. Thank you. Please join me in thanking the Bishop for a presentation on the cause of Augustus Tolton. So much. I do have, oh, were you going to? Please. I do have just a few logistic announcements as we move towards lunch. Let's see, don't want to forget anything. First, lunch itself, of course, is in the dining room. 3 serving lines to process this rather large community. We're back at 1:15. If you'd be so kind, try to be back in your seats by, say, 10 after or so that we can begin crisply. That would be wonderful. And then finally, those of you who are joining us online, it's very important that you remember the Zoom link for this afternoon's portion is different than the Zoom link for this morning's portion. It's in the same Zoom link invitation email you got. It's just further down. So scroll down to the second link for this afternoon's session. And if you would be so kind as well to please try to log on by 10 after or so, we'll all be ready to begin. Our 1:15 session is with 2 respondents and more conversation. So I think that's it. Please do enjoy your lunch and we'll see you back soon. Thank you. Oh, and I'm sorry, one more. Oh, so 3 serving lines, but the other 3 is 3 to a table, please. So they've set up to accommodate that, 3 to a table. Thank you.